2,000 men stand in the mud. They are starving. They are exhausted. Many are sick with dysentery. They have marched hundreds of miles through enemy territory with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no hope of retreat. Before them stretches an army that outnumbers them 40-1. 80,000 French soldiers in gleaming armor. The finest knights in Europe. Fresh troops with full bellies and absolute confidence in their victory. The year is 1415. The place is a muddy field in northern France that history will remember as Agincourt. What happens in the next few hours should be impossible. The smaller force should be annihilated. The battle should be over before it begins. Every military calculation says the English army will be destroyed. But military calculations do not account for mud. They do not account for terrain. They do not account for desperation. And they do not account for a weapon that can fire 12 arrows per minute into a mass of armored men who cannot move, cannot see, and cannot escape. How does an army on the verge of collapse defeat a force 40 times its size? How do starving archers destroy the greatest knights in Christendom? And how does a single afternoon change the course of medieval warfare forever? This is the story of Agincourt. This is the story of the impossible victory. To understand Agincourt, we must first understand that England and France had been locked in conflict for nearly 80 years before this battle was fought. This was not a simple war with clear causes and clean boundaries. It was a tangled dynastic struggle, a contest over who had the right to rule France, a conflict that would drag on for more than a century and devastate both kingdoms. The war had begun in 1337 when King Edward III of England claimed the French throne. His claim was based on lineage. His mother was the daughter of a French king. But the French nobility rejected this claim, citing Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line. They crowned their own king instead. Edward responded with invasion. For decades, the war had swung back and forth. England had won stunning victories at Crécy and Poitiers, capturing the French king himself. But these triumphs had not translated into lasting conquest. France was too large, too populous, and too wealthy to be held down permanently. The English controlled portions of France, particularly in the southwest, but they could not force a final settlement. By the early 15th century, both kingdoms were exhausted. England was financially drained. The costs of maintaining armies in France, of garrisoning conquered territories, of fighting a war across the Channel, had emptied the royal treasury. The English population was tired of taxes, tired of war, tired of seeing their sons march off to die in foreign fields. France was equally weary. The kingdom had been ravaged by English raids. Entire regions had been burned. Harvests had been destroyed. The economy was in ruins. Worse, France was politically fractured. Rival noble factions were fighting for control of the kingdom, sometimes allying with the English against their own countrymen. The French crown was weak, unable to impose its authority even within its own borders. This was the world into which Henry V ascended the English throne in 1413. He was young, 26 years old, energetic and ambitious. He had been a soldier since his teenage years, fighting in Wales against rebellion. He understood warfare at a practical level. He also understood that his legitimacy as king was questionable. His father, Henry IV, had seized the throne from Richard II in a coup. The House of Lancaster was still establishing its authority. Henry V needed a military victory to secure his position, to unite England behind his rule, and to prove that God favored his kingship. He needed France. In the summer of 1415, Henry assembled an invasion force at Southampton. The army numbered perhaps 12,000 men, a substantial force by the standards of the time. It included longbowmen, men-at-arms, and the support staff necessary for a medieval campaign. ships were gathered to transport this force across the English Channel. The plan was to land in Normandy, to capture the port city of Harfleur, and then to use that as a base for further operations. Harfleur was strategically valuable. It controlled access to the Seine River and could serve as a staging point for an advance on Paris. If Henry could take and hold Harfleur, he would have a foothold in France from which to launch future campaigns. The invasion began well. The English fleet crossed the Channel without incident and landed near Harfleur in mid-August. But the siege that followed proved far more difficult than Henry had anticipated. The city was well fortified and stubbornly defended. Weeks passed. English soldiers dug trenches and built siege engines. They bombarded the walls with cannon and catapults. They attempted to undermine the fortifications. The siege dragged on through late summer into early autumn, and while the English waited, disease struck the army. Dysentery, the scourge of medieval campaigns, swept through the ranks. Men fell ill by the hundreds, suffering from severe diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness. Many died. Others became too sick to fight and had to be invalided back to England. Harfleur finally surrendered in late September, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Henry had lost perhaps a third of his army to disease and combat. He had spent weeks on a single siege. His supplies were running low. Winter was approaching. The strategic situation was grim. Henry faced a choice. He could garrison Harfleur and sail the remainder of his army back to England, declaring a limited victory and planning to return the following year, or he could attempt something bolder. He decided to march his army overland to Calais, an English-held port on the northern coast of France. The march would be a demonstration of English strength, a way of showing that Henry could move through French territory at will. It would also allow him to return to England without the appearance of retreat. The distance was roughly 120 miles. With good weather and no interference, the march could be completed in a week or two. But the weather was not good, and the French were not going to allow the English to march unmolested. The English army that left Harfleur in early October numbered perhaps 6,000 men. Disease and garrison duties had reduced Henry's force to half its original size. The soldiers who remained were tired, hungry, and sick. They carried minimal supplies, expecting to live off the land during the march. But the French had learned from previous English campaigns. They had adopted a scorched earth policy. Villages along the English route were evacuated. Crops were burned. Livestock was driven away. The English found empty fields and abandoned towns. They foraged what they could, but it was not enough. The march became a test of endurance. Rain fell continuously, turning roads into rivers of mud. The soldiers slogged through ankle-deep muck, carrying their weapons and equipment, growing weaker with each mile. They had expected to cross the Somme River at a series of fords, but when they arrived, they found the French had destroyed the bridges and fortified the crossing points. Henry was forced to march east along the southern bank of the Somme, searching for a place to cross. Days passed. The army's supplies dwindled. Men began to starve. Discipline started to fray. Stragglers fell behind and were captured or killed by French patrols. The planned week-long march stretched into 2 weeks, then 3. Finally, near the end of October, the English found an undefended ford and crossed the Somme. But they were now deep in French territory, far from Calais, surrounded by enemy forces, and they were being tracked by a French army that was growing larger every day. The French had been mustering their forces since learning of Henry's landing. Messengers had ridden across France, calling nobles to war. This was a matter of honor. The English king was marching through French lands, defying French authority. He had to be stopped. He had to be destroyed. The French army that gathered was enormous by medieval standards. Estimates vary, but the force likely numbered between 25 and 30,000 men. Some sources claim even higher numbers. It was dominated by heavily armored cavalry, the pride of French nobility. These were men who had trained for war since childhood, who could afford the finest armor and weapons, who believed themselves invincible. They positioned themselves across the English line of march, blocking the road to Calais. They chose their ground carefully, selecting a position where the terrain would favor their numbers, and they waited for the English to arrive. Henry, learning that his path was blocked, understood that he had no choice but to fight. His army was too weak to force a crossing against determined opposition. They could not retreat back across the Somme. They could not survive much longer without supplies. The only option was to attack, to somehow break through the French position, and to hope that luck and God would grant them victory. On the evening of October 24, 1415, the English army camped within sight of the French. The soldiers could see the enemy campfires stretching across the fields. They could hear the sounds of the French preparing for battle, the ring of hammers on armor, the whinny of horses, the voices of thousands of men confident in tomorrow's slaughter. The English knew they were likely to die. Some wrote final letters. Some made confession to priests. Some simply sat in silence, too exhausted and hungry to do anything else. They had marched hundreds of miles. They had suffered disease and starvation, and now they faced an army that outnumbered them at least 4-1, possibly much more. Morning would bring battle, and morning would bring what seemed like certain annihilation. The English force that prepared for battle on the night of October 24th numbered approximately 6,000 men. These were not fresh troops. They were the survivors of a brutal campaign, the remnants of an army that had been ravaged by disease and starvation. Many were sick, all were hungry. They had been marching for weeks through hostile territory with minimal rations. The core of the army consisted of archers, perhaps 5,000 men, armed with the English longbow. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. Most were commoners, yeomen, farmers, and craftsmen who had been called up for military service. English law required that men practice archery regularly, and this had created a large pool of skilled bowmen. But skill with a bow did not make one immune to disease or hunger. The longbow was a formidable weapon, but it required strength and training to use effectively. A warbow had a draw weight of over 100 pounds, far more than modern recreational bows. Drawing such a bow required using the muscles of the back and shoulders, not just the arms. An experienced archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, maintaining this rate for extended periods. The arrows could penetrate armor at close range and could certainly kill an unarmored man at 200 yards or more. But the effectiveness of the longbow depended on circumstances. Archers were vulnerable in close combat. They wore little armor, usually just a helmet and perhaps a padded jacket. If enemy cavalry could close with them, they would be slaughtered. Their strength lay in volume of fire, in massed volleys that could disrupt formations and kill horses. The remainder of the English army consisted of men-at-arms, perhaps 800 to 1,000 heavily armored soldiers. These were the elite of the force, nobles and professional warriors who could afford plate armor and quality weapons. They would fight on foot, forming a defensive line that the archers could shelter behind. But they were too few to hold a line against the French cavalry if the archers failed. King Henry V commanded this army personally. He was young but experienced. He understood the desperate nature of his situation. His strategy would be defensive, to find a position where the terrain would limit French mobility and where his archers could do maximum damage before the French closed to melee range. He could not afford to attack. He could only hope to survive the French assault, and then, if opportunity arose, to counterattack. The morale of the English troops was complex. They were exhausted and hungry, certainly. They knew they were outnumbered, But they also had a fatalistic determination. There was no retreat. There was no escape. The only way home was through the French army. This created a psychological state where fear was balanced by resignation. They would fight because they had no other option. There was also a religious dimension. Medieval soldiers believed that God determined the outcome of battles. Victory was a sign of divine favor. The English had been confessing their sins, taking communion, preparing their souls for death. If they died, they would die in a state of grace. And if God willed them to victory, then no amount of French numbers would matter. This belief system provided a mental framework for facing impossible odds. The French army that blocked the English path was massive, confident, and disorganized. Estimates of its size vary wildly in historical sources, from 15,000 to over 100,000. Modern historians generally place the number between 25 and 30,000, though even this is uncertain. What is clear is that the French substantially outnumbered the English, likely by a factor of 4 or 5 to 1 at minimum. The army was dominated by armored cavalry, the flower of French nobility. These were men who had spent their lives preparing for war. They wore full-plate armor, articulated suits of steel that covered them from head to toe. They rode war horses, large destriers bred for combat. They carried lances, swords, maces, and other weapons of close combat. They were confident in their invincibility, and they had reason for that confidence. Armored cavalry had dominated European battlefields for centuries. A mounted knight in full armor was a terrifying force. The combination of speed, mass, and protection made cavalry charges nearly unstoppable. Infantry formations broke before the impact. Lighter troops fled. The social order of medieval Europe was built on the military supremacy of the armored horsemen. The French knights were eager for battle. Many were young men seeking glory and reputation. Capturing or killing an English nobleman could bring ransom money and social advancement. Defeating the English king himself would be the ultimate prize. The mood in the French camp the night before battle was celebratory, almost festive. They were certain of victory, but the French army had serious organizational problems. There was no unified command structure. The nominal commander was the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, but dozens of nobles commanded their own retinues and considered themselves equal in authority. Decisions had to be made by consensus, and consensus was difficult to achieve among proud, competitive men. There was also disagreement about tactics. Some French commanders wanted to wait, to let hunger and disease finish the English without risking French lives. Others wanted to use the French crossbowmen to weaken the English before committing the cavalry. But the majority, especially the younger knights, wanted immediate action. They wanted to charge, to close with the enemy, to fight hand to hand as their training and honor demanded. This lack of coordination would prove fatal. Medieval battles were chaotic under the best circumstances. Without clear leadership and agreed-upon tactics, they could descend into confusion very quickly. The French had numbers and equipment, but they lacked the unity and discipline that would allow them to use those advantages effectively. The French also made a critical error in assessing their enemy. They saw a small, starving, exhausted English army and assumed victory was certain. They did not seriously consider how the terrain might affect the battle. They did not think carefully about how to counter the English longbows. They saw the enemy as beaten already and themselves as merely collecting the spoils. This combination of overconfidence and disorganization, of superior numbers and inferior command, would shape everything that followed. The battlefield at Agincourt was not chosen by either commander as ideal ground. The French had positioned themselves to block the English route to Calais. The English had no choice but to fight where the French stood. But the specific characteristics of this particular piece of ground would determine the outcome of the battle more than any decision made by either army. The field was located between two woods, the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt. These woods were thick, impassable to cavalry, and they created a natural funnel. The open ground between them was perhaps 900 to 1,000 yards wide, narrowing to perhaps 700 yards at the point where the armies would meet. This constriction would have enormous tactical implications. The field itself was farmland, recently ploughed and planted with winter wheat. October in northern France is wet. It had been raining for days. The ploughed earth had been churned into thick, clinging mud. This was not the solid ground needed for cavalry charges. It was a quagmire that would suck at boots and hooves, that would tire men and horses, that would slow movement to a crawl. The English position was at the northern end of the field, with their backs to the road to Calais. Henry positioned his men-at-arms in the center, in a line perhaps 4 men deep. The archers were placed on the flanks, and possibly in wedge formations between blocks of men-at-arms. This positioning allowed the archers to fire into the flanks of any force attacking the English center. Critically, Henry ordered his archers to prepare defensive positions. They carried sharpened stakes, wooden poles perhaps 6 feet long with fire-hardened points. These stakes were driven into the ground at an angle, points outward, creating a barrier against cavalry. The stakes would not stop a determined charge, but they would disrupt it, breaking up the cohesion of the cavalry line and creating confusion. The French position was at the southern end of the field. They could see the English clearly. They could see how few the English were. The sight reinforced their confidence, but they could not easily see the state of the ground. Between the two armies, from a distance, muddy earth looks much like solid earth. The depth and consistency of the mud would only become apparent when men tried to move through it. The French deployed in 3 lines, or battles, as medieval sources call them. The first line consisted of dismounted men-at-arms, perhaps 8,000 heavily armored men on foot. They had chosen to fight dismounted because the narrow field offered limited room for cavalry maneuvers, and because previous battles had shown that English archers could kill horses, leaving mounted knights vulnerable on the ground. The second line was also dismounted men-at-arms, another large body of armored soldiers waiting in reserve. The third line was mounted cavalry, intended to exploit any breakthrough or to ride down fleeing English troops after victory was achieved. On the flanks, the French positioned cavalry units intended to sweep around the English position and attack the archers from the sides or rear. This was sound tactics in theory. In practice, the woods and the mud would make these flanking maneuvers nearly impossible. The battlefield, then, was a narrow corridor of mud flanked by impassable woods. Any attack would have to come straight ahead, and any attacking force would be compressed as it advanced into the narrowing funnel between the woods. The mud would slow movement and tire troops, and the entire attacking force would be exposed to flanking fire from English archers. Henry likely understood these advantages. He had chosen to position his army where the field was narrowest, maximizing the effect of the terrain. But whether he fully grasped how decisive these factors would be is unclear. He was preparing to defend against overwhelming numbers. He hoped the terrain would help. He could not have known it would determine the outcome. Mud is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It does not cut or pierce. It does not explode or burn. But in the context of medieval warfare, mud could be as lethal as any sword or arrow. A man in full plate armor carried 60 to 80 pounds of steel. The armor was well distributed across the body, and a fit man could move reasonably well while wearing it. But this assumed solid footing. On muddy ground, every step required effort. The boots would sink. The weight of the armor would drive the feet deeper into the soft earth. Each step required pulling the foot free, lifting it, planting it again. This was exhausting work. For horses, the situation was even worse. A war horse with an armored rider might carry a total weight of 300 pounds or more. The horse's hooves, relatively small points of contact with the ground, would sink deep into mud. The horse would have to work much harder to move forward, and the risk of stumbling or becoming mired was significant. Medieval battles were intensely physical. Men fought in armor for hours, swinging heavy weapons, pushing and grappling. Fatigue was a constant factor. Combatants would become exhausted, slowing their movements, making mistakes. Fresh troops had an enormous advantage over tired ones. The mud at Agincourt would pre-exhaust the French before they even reached the English line. By the time the French men-at-arms crossed the field, they would be gasping for breath, their legs burning with effort, their arms heavy. They would face English defenders who had stood still, who had conserved their energy, who would be comparatively fresh. This was the silent weapon. Not the mud itself, but what the mud did to human endurance. The battlefield had become an environmental trap. The French were walking into it without understanding the danger. To understand Agincourt, one must understand the longbow. It was not a new weapon in 1415. Bows had been used in warfare for thousands of years, but the English longbow represented a particular development, a weapon that combined power, range, and rate of fire in a way that other contemporary missile weapons could not match. The longbow was a simple object. It was a single piece of wood, usually yew, about 6 feet in length, shaped and tapered to provide spring and strength. The bowstring was made of hemp or linen. There were no complex mechanisms, no moving parts. It was ancient technology refined to near perfection, but simple did not mean easy to use. Drawing a war bow required enormous strength. The draw weight, the force needed to pull the string back to full draw, was typically between 100 and 150 pounds. Modern Olympic archery uses bows with draw weights of around 40 to 50 pounds. A war bow was 3 times as powerful. Drawing such a bow required technique. An archer did not pull with his arms. He used his entire upper body, engaging the muscles of his back and shoulders. The motion was more of a push with the bow hand, while pulling with the string hand, using the large muscle groups of the torso. This allowed the archer to draw the heavy bow repeatedly without exhausting his arms. An experienced archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. This rate of fire was extraordinary. A crossbow, the other major missile weapon of the period, might achieve 2 shots per minute, perhaps 3 for a very skilled operator. The longbow could put 6 times as many projectiles in the air in the same time period. The arrows themselves were about 30 inches long, made of ash or poplar, with steel bodkin points designed to penetrate armor. A bodkin was a narrow, pointed arrowhead that could punch through mail and, at close range, even pierce plate armor. The arrows were not particularly accurate at long range. Individual aimed shots were difficult beyond 50 yards, but accuracy was not the point. The longbow's power lay in massed volleys. 1,000 archers loosing together would send 10,000 arrows into the air per minute. This created a lethal zone that nothing could survive. Horses would be hit and would fall, throwing their riders. Unarmored men would be killed outright. Even armored men would be struck multiple times. And while their armor might stop most arrows, some would find gaps at joints and visors. The psychological effect was as important as the physical casualties. Being under arrow fire was terrifying. The arrows came in clouds, making a sound like heavy rain as they fell. Men could see their comrades dropping around them. Horses would panic. Even disciplined troops would waver under sustained archery. But the longbow had limitations. Archers were vulnerable in close combat. They wore minimal armor because they needed mobility. A knight in full plate could cut through archers like wheat if he could close the distance. The longbow was a weapon of defense and distance. It required protection and space to be effective. At Agincourt, the English archers would have both. The defensive stakes would slow cavalry charges. The mud would tire the French, and the archers would have the outnumbered, time and space to loose volley after volley into the approaching enemy. The longbow would be used in ideal conditions, and it would prove devastating. The French knights who prepared for battle at Agincourt wore the finest armor that 15th century metallurgy could produce. This was not the mail armor of earlier centuries. It was full plate, articulated suits of steel that covered the entire body. The armor consisted of many pieces. A helmet protected the head, often a bassinet with a visor that could be lowered to protect the face. A breastplate covered the torso. Pauldrons protected the shoulders. Rear braces and vambraces covered the upper and lower arms. Gauntlets protected the hands. A fold of articulated plates protected the waist and hips. Cuisses and greaves covered the thighs and lower legs. Sabatons protected the feet. These pieces were connected by leather straps and articulated joints that allowed movement while maintaining protection. The armor was expensive, far beyond the means of common soldiers. It was also heavy, 60 to 80 pounds of steel distributed across the body. But for all its sophistication, plate armor had vulnerabilities. The joints where pieces connected were weak points. The gap at the visor could be targeted. The back of the knee was difficult to armor effectively. An opponent who could grapple with an armored man could find these weak spots with a dagger. More relevant to Agincourt, armor did not protect against blunt trauma. An arrow that did not penetrate could still deliver enormous force. A bodkin arrow fired from a longbow at close range carried enough energy to dent steel. Repeated impacts could stun, bruise, or even break bones beneath the armor. A man struck by multiple arrows might not be penetrated, but could be knocked down or concussed. The armor also imposed costs. It reduced visibility and hearing. The visor limited peripheral vision. The helmet muffled sound. In the chaos of battle, this could be disorienting. Communication became difficult. Armored men relied on visual signals and prearranged plans, and the armor required energy to move. On solid ground, a fit man could function well in plate armor, but on muddy ground, the energy cost multiplied. The French men-at-arms would discover this as they advanced across the field at Agincourt. Their armor, which should have protected them, would become a burden that exhausted them before they reached the enemy. The English and French armies represented different tactical philosophies. The English relied on combined arms, using archers and men-at-arms in mutually supporting roles. The archers would weaken and disrupt the enemy. The men-at-arms would hold a defensive position. Together, they could defeat a larger force. The French relied on shock and mass. Armored men, whether mounted or on foot, would close with the enemy and overwhelm them through superior numbers and equipment. This had worked for generations. It had made the French nobility the dominant military force in Europe. They saw no reason to change tactics, but tactics must adapt to terrain and circumstances. At Agincourt, French tactics would encounter conditions they were not designed for. The narrow field negated numerical superiority. The mud negated mobility. The longbow negated armor's protective value through volume of fire. Every French advantage would be turned into a disadvantage by the specific conditions of this battlefield. The English, defensive and desperate, would fight in the way that maximized their strengths. The French, confident and aggressive, would attack in a way that exposed their weaknesses. The clash between these two approaches would produce one of the most lopsided battles in military history. The English army rose before dawn on October 25, 1415. The men were cold, hungry, and exhausted. Many had spent the night standing in their positions, too wet and uncomfortable to sleep. They could hear the French across the Field, the sounds of thousands of men and horses preparing for battle. King Henry ordered his troops to hear Mass. Priests moved through the ranks, offering communion, hearing confessions. This was standard practice before medieval battles. Men wanted to die in a state of grace, to ensure their souls would go to heaven. The religious preparation also served a practical purpose. It calmed nerves. It gave the soldiers something to focus on other than their fear. After the religious observances, Henry addressed his men. We do not have an accurate record of what he said. Later accounts, written long after the battle, put elaborate speeches in his mouth. The most famous is Shakespeare's St. Crispin's Day speech, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." This is beautiful poetry, but almost certainly not what Henry actually said. What is likely is that Henry reminded his men of their duty, of the justice of their cause, of the fact that they were fighting for their king and their country. He probably emphasized that retreat was impossible, that their only path home was through the French army. He may have invoked God's favor, claiming that divine will would determine the outcome regardless of numbers. Whatever he said, the soldiers understood their situation. They were going to fight, they were probably going to die, but they would sell their lives dearly. The archers checked their equipment, their bows, their arrows, their stakes. The men-at-arms tightened their armor, checked their weapons, and they waited. The French were also preparing, but in a very different mood. There was confidence, even arrogance. Some French knights worried that the English might try to slip away during the night. They were disappointed to see the English still in position at dawn. Now there would be battle, glory, and profit. The French commanders debated their approach. The original plan had been to use crossbowmen to weaken the English before committing the main force. But there was pressure from the nobles to attack immediately, to not allow the common crossbowmen to steal their glory. Eventually, the decision was made. The first line of dismounted men-at-arms would advance on foot and overwhelm the English through sheer weight of numbers. Cavalry units on the flanks would charge the English archers, disrupting them and preventing them from supporting the center. Once the English line was broken, the second and third French lines would advance to complete the slaughter. It was a straightforward plan, relying on French numerical and material superiority. But the French did not immediately attack. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in the sky. The two armies stood facing each other across the muddy field. The English remained in their defensive positions. The French made preparations but did not advance. The delay was likely due to continued disagreement among French commanders and the difficulty of coordinating such a large force. Getting thousands of armored men organized and ready to advance in unison was not simple. But the delay also had psychological effects. For the English, the waiting was agonizing. They stood in the cold and mud, hungry and tired, watching the massive French army and waiting for the attack that would likely kill them. Some men lost control of their bowels from fear, a common response to pre-battle stress. Others prayed. Others simply stared ahead, too numb to think or feel. For the French, the delay allowed confidence to build to overconfidence. They looked at the small English force and saw easy prey. They joked and boasted about how many prisoners they would take, how much ransom they would collect. Some nobles argued about who would have the honor of capturing King Henry himself. Finally, King Henry made a decision. He could not wait any longer. His men were deteriorating physically and mentally. He needed to force the issue, to provoke the French into attacking or to attack himself. He ordered his army to advance. This was a risky move. Advancing toward a larger force could look like aggression, but Henry had no intention of attacking. He marched his army forward about 3/4 of a mile, to a position where the field narrowed further between the woods. This new position was more defensible. It was also closer to the French, well within bow range. The English archers drove their stakes into the ground again, creating a new defensive barrier. They strung their bows. They nocked arrows and waited. The movement had served its purpose. The French could not ignore an enemy advancing toward them. They had to respond. The French cavalry on the flanks began to move forward. These were the units assigned to attack the English archers. They mounted their horses and prepared to charge. The main body of French men-at-arms began to advance on foot, a vast mass of armored men moving slowly forward across the muddy field. The battle had begun. The French cavalry charged first, thundering toward the English flanks where the archers were positioned. Several hundred horsemen, armored and confident, lowered their lances and spurred their mounts forward. This should have been decisive. Cavalry crashing into lightly armored archers should have scattered them like chaff. But the mud immediately slowed the charge. The horses struggled through the soft ground. What should have been a gallop became a labored canter. The cavalry formation, which required cohesion and speed to be effective, began to break apart as some horses moved faster than others. The English archers did not wait passively. As the cavalry came within range, they loosed their first volleys. Thousands of arrows arced through the air and fell among the charging horsemen. The arrows were not particularly accurate at this range, but they did not need to be. The target was a mass of horses and men. Most arrows would hit something. Horses were struck first. An arrow might not kill a horse immediately, but it would hurt and frighten the animal. Wounded horses reared, threw their riders, or veered off course. The charge lost more cohesion. Some horsemen reached the English line. They ran into the stakes, the fire-hardened points that had been driven into the ground. Horses impaled themselves on the stakes. Riders were thrown. Those few cavalry who made it through the stakes and reached the archers found themselves in a nightmare. They were surrounded by lightly armored men who could dodge and move, while the horsemen were constrained by their armor and their mounts. Archers dropped their bows and drew swords, daggers, or mallets. They attacked the horses, hamstringing them or stabbing them in the belly. Once the horse went down, the rider was vulnerable. An armored man on the ground was slow and clumsy. Archers could swarm him, find the weak points in his armor, and kill him. Within minutes, the French cavalry charge had disintegrated. Some horsemen retreated. Some were killed. Some were unhorsed and captured. The attack had failed completely. Worse, the retreating cavalry rode back through the advancing French men-at-arms, disrupting their formation and creating confusion. But the main French advance continued. 8,000 armored men moved forward across the field, shields raised, weapons ready. They could see the small English force ahead. They could see how few the English were. Despite the cavalry failure, they were confident. Armor would protect them from arrows. Numbers would overwhelm the English line. This was what they had trained for. They did not yet understand that they were walking into a killing ground. The French men-at-arms advanced slowly across the muddy field. They were organized in a dense mass, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. This formation was intended to present a unified front and to provide mutual protection, but it also meant they were packed tightly together, unable to maneuver individually. The mud was deeper than it had appeared from a distance. Each step required effort. The men sank to their ankles, sometimes to their calves. They had to pull their feet free with each stride. The armor, which weighed 60 to 80 pounds, made this exponentially harder. Within minutes, the men were breathing heavily. Within a few hundred yards, they were exhausted. The field narrowed as they advanced, compressed by the converging woods. The French formation, already dense, became even more packed. Men were pressed together so tightly they could barely move their arms. Those in the front ranks could not retreat even if they wanted to, because the ranks behind were pushing forward, and all the while the arrows fell. The English archers were loosing as fast as they could draw and release. Each archer could manage 10 to 12 shots per minute. 5,000 archers meant 50,000 to 60,000 arrows per minute. The sky darkened with shafts. At long range, the arrows fell like rain, striking. Helmets and armor, deflecting or sticking. They did not penetrate plate armor at this distance, but they rattled against steel with a sound like hail. Horses that had survived the initial cavalry charge were struck repeatedly and collapsed. Men were hit in the arms, legs, or through the gaps in their armor. As the range closed, the arrows became more lethal. At 100 yards, a bodkin point could penetrate plate armor if it struck at the right angle. At 50 yards, it could punch through steel reliably. The French were now in the killing zone. Arrows struck visors and pierced through into faces. Arrows hit throats and groins where armor was thinner. Arrows hit hands and wrists, crippling men's ability to fight. The front ranks of the French advance began to falter. Men stumbled and fell. Others stepped over them or on them, driven forward by the pressure from behind. The fallen men could not easily rise. The mud sucked at them. Their armor weighed them down. Other men stepped on them, driving them deeper into the muck. Some men drowned in mud that was only inches deep, unable to lift their helmeted heads, suffocating in the soft earth. The French advance slowed further. What had begun as a walk had become a crawl. The exhaustion, the casualties, the horror of watching comrades fall, all of it eroded the formation's cohesion. But they kept coming. They had no choice. The men behind were pushing them forward. To stop was to be trampled. The only option was to reach the English line and engage in close combat where their numbers would tell. Finally, the first French men-at-arms reached the English position. They crashed into the line of English men-at-arms, swinging swords, axes, and maces. For a moment it seemed the French might break through. They outnumbered the English significantly, even after their losses crossing the field. Sheer mass might overwhelm the defenders, but the English line held. The French men-at-arms who reached the English line were exhausted. They had just crossed several hundred yards of mud while wearing heavy armor and being shot at continuously. They were gasping for breath, their legs trembling with fatigue. They faced English men-at-arms who were comparatively fresh, who had stood still while the French exhausted themselves. The combat was brutal and close. Men swung swords and axes at each other, aiming for weak points in armor. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of steel on steel, of men shouting, cursing, and screaming. But the exhausted French could not press their advantage in numbers. They were so tightly packed that many could not even raise their weapons properly. They were crushed together by the press of men behind them, still being pushed forward by those in the rear. The English, fighting in a looser formation, had room to move and swing. They could step back and thrust, step forward and strike. The French, locked in place by their own numbers, could barely move. It was less a battle than a slaughter. The English struck at French heads and faces, finding the gaps in visors, crushing helmets with maces, stabbing through throat guards. French men fell, but there was nowhere for them to fall. The press of bodies held them upright even in death. Some men suffocated, unable to breathe in the crush. Others were killed by the English and then pressed forward by the men behind them, corpses shoved into the English line by the sheer momentum of the French advance. The archers, seeing the French engaged in melee and unable to respond, dropped their bows and joined the fight. They grabbed swords, hammers, mallets, any weapon they could find. They attacked the flanks of the French formation, which was so compressed that the men on the edges could not turn to defend themselves. The archers stabbed and hacked, targeting the backs of knees, groins, armpits, anywhere armor was weak. The French first line, which had numbered perhaps 8,000 men, began to disintegrate. The front ranks were killed or captured. The middle ranks were trapped by the crush. The rear ranks, realizing what was happening, tried to retreat, but found their path blocked by the second line advancing behind them. The field in front of the English position became a mass of dead and dying men. Bodies piled up so thick that they formed barriers. The mud was churned into a bloody slurry. Men who fell found themselves pinned under corpses, unable to rise, drowning in mud and blood. And still the French came. The second line, seeing the first line engaged, advanced to support them. They did not understand that the first line had already been destroyed. They could not see through the mass of men and the mud and the chaos. They pushed forward, adding their weight to the disaster. What happened next is difficult to comprehend without understanding the physics of a medieval melee. When thousands of men are packed together, pushing forward, individual control is lost. The mass moves as a single entity, driven by the weight and momentum of thousands of bodies. Men at the front are crushed forward whether they want to go or not. Men at the back push forward, unable to see what is happening ahead, only knowing they must advance. At Agincourt, this created a situation where the French were literally crushing themselves to death against the English line. The bodies of dead and wounded Frenchmen piled up in front of the English position. New arrivals climbed over these bodies, trying to get at the English. They slipped on the bloody corpses. They fell. Others climbed over them. The pile grew higher. English accounts describe walls of bodies, heaps of dead men stacked so high that the English had to climb onto the corpses to continue fighting. French knights trapped beneath these piles suffocated or were crushed by the weight of armored men piled on top of them. Men who might have survived their wounds died unable to breathe, buried beneath their own comrades. The archers continued to shoot into the packed mass of French soldiers. At this range, they could not miss. Every arrow found a target. Men at the back of the French formation were being killed by arrows, while men at the front were being killed by English blades. Those in the middle were trapped, unable to fight, unable to flee, simply waiting to die. The French second line met the same fate as the first. They advanced into a killing ground where movement was impossible and survival was unlikely. They added their bodies to the pile. The battle stopped being a contest and became an execution. Some French soldiers tried to surrender. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands. But in the chaos and the press, it was difficult to make surrender clear. Many who tried to yield were killed anyway. Others were pulled from the pile and taken prisoner, but there were so many potential prisoners that the English could not guard them all properly. King Henry, watching from the English lines, saw French nobles being captured in large numbers. Prisoners meant ransom, and ransom meant wealth. For a medieval king, prisoners were valuable. But Henry also saw that his army was still engaged, that French troops were still on the field, and that his men were exhausted from the fighting. Then word came that the French third line, the mounted cavalry held in reserve, was preparing to charge. Henry made a decision that has been controversial ever since. He ordered the prisoners killed. Henry's order to kill the prisoners was ruthless but not irrational from a military perspective. His army was still in danger. The French had a third line of fresh troops. If the battle resumed, the English would need every soldier. They could not spare men to guard hundreds or thousands of prisoners. And if the battle turned against the English, those prisoners might rearm themselves and rejoin the fight. Some English soldiers hesitated to obey. Killing unarmed, surrendered men violated the chivalric code. It also meant destroying valuable sources of ransom. But Henry was insistent. The prisoners were killed, most likely, by cutting their throats or bashing in their heads with mallets. It was not a quick or clean process. It was a massacre. This act has stained Henry's reputation. Even by medieval standards, it was seen as harsh, but it reflects the desperation of the situation. Henry could not know if the French third line would attack. He could not afford to take chances. From his perspective, the prisoners were a threat that had to be eliminated. The French third line, seeing the destruction of the first two lines and the execution of the prisoners, did not charge. They withdrew from the field, refusing to add themselves to the slaughter. The battle was over. What remained was a field of horror. Thousands of French dead lay piled in front of the English lines. The ground was churned mud mixed with blood and offal. The smell was overwhelming, the stench of death and excrement, from men who had lost control of their bowels in terror or death. Wounded men cried out for help that would not come. The English, exhausted and stunned by their own survival, could barely comprehend what they had just experienced. The battle had lasted perhaps 3 to 4 hours. The fighting, the most intense killing, had probably occurred in a span of 2 hours or less. In that time, the French had lost perhaps 6,000 to 10,000 men killed, with thousands more captured. English losses were perhaps a few hundred at most. The disproportion was staggering. An army of 6,000 exhausted, starving men had destroyed an army 5 times its size. It should not have been possible. But the combination of terrain, tactics, and French mistakes had produced a catastrophe. When the fighting ended, the English remained in their positions, wary of a renewed attack, but no attack came. The French third line withdrew. The remnants of the French army, perhaps 15,000 men, who had not been engaged, retreated from the field. They left their dead where they lay. The scale of the casualties became apparent as the English moved through the battlefield. Bodies were everywhere, piled in heaps, scattered across the mud, lying in the ditches at the edges of the field. French nobles lay dead in their expensive armor, their wealth unable to protect them. Common soldiers lay beside them, all equal in death. The English began the process of identifying the French dead. This was important because noble prisoners could be ransomed, but noble corpses could still have value. The families of dead French nobles would pay to recover the bodies for proper burial. The English stripped the corpses of armor and valuables. This was standard practice after medieval battles. The victors had the right to plunder the defeated. Among the French dead were many of the most prominent nobles of France. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France and commander of the French army, was dead. The Duke of Alençon was dead. The Duke of Brabant was dead. The Duke of Bar was dead. Dozens of counts and other high-ranking nobles had been killed. The French military leadership had been decapitated. The English casualties were remarkably light. Perhaps 100 to 400 men had been killed, most of them in the initial cavalry charge, or in the close combat when the French lines reached the English position. Among the English dead were a few nobles, including the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk, but the proportion of English to French dead was perhaps 1 to 20 or worse. This was unprecedented. Medieval battles rarely produced such lopsided casualty ratios. Even decisive victories usually resulted in both sides taking significant losses. Agincourt was different. It was a massacre dressed up as a battle. King Henry did not remain long on the battlefield. His army was still in French territory, still vulnerable, still hungry and exhausted. The victory had saved them from immediate destruction, but it had not solved their fundamental problem. They needed to reach Calais. The march resumed the day after the battle. The English soldiers, carrying whatever plunder they could manage, trudged north toward the coast. The French did not attempt to intercept them. The disaster at Agincourt had shocked the French leadership into paralysis. No one wanted to confront the English again. The English reached Calais in early November. From there, they sailed back to England. The campaign that had seemed likely to end in disaster concluded in triumph. Henry had won one of the most spectacular victories in medieval military history. He had done so with an army that should have been destroyed. The return to England was celebratory. Henry was greeted as a conquering hero. The victory at Agincourt validated his kingship, his military skill, and his claim to the French throne. The English people, who had endured years of war and taxation, finally had a victory to celebrate. But the strategic situation had not changed fundamentally. England had won a battle, but it had not conquered France. The French kingdom remained vast and powerful. The war would continue for decades more. Agincourt was a spectacular moment, but it was not a decisive strategic victory. In France, the reaction to Agincourt was shock, grief, and recrimination. The kingdom had lost a significant portion of its military nobility in a single afternoon. Dozens of noble families had lost their heads, their heirs, their futures. The political and social structure of France had been severely damaged. There was also shame. France had outnumbered the English dramatically. The French had better equipment, better supplies, and every advantage except leadership and tactics, and they had been destroyed. The defeat could not be explained away as bad luck or divine intervention. It was the result of poor decisions, poor coordination, and overconfidence. Recriminations flew. Survivors blamed the commanders. The commanders, most of whom were dead, could not defend themselves. The King of France, Charles VI, was mentally unstable and could not provide leadership. The kingdom descended further into the civil conflict between Burgundian and Armagnac factions, each blaming the other for the disaster. But there was also a desire to learn. French military thinkers began to reconsider their tactics. The assumption that armored cavalry was invincible had been shattered. Future French armies would place more emphasis on combined arms, on using infantry and missile troops alongside cavalry. The lesson of Agincourt was that numbers and equipment were not enough. Tactics and terrain mattered enormously. The French nobles who had been captured at Agincourt and survived the massacre of prisoners faced years of captivity. Ransom negotiations for high-ranking prisoners were complex and could take years to resolve. The prisoners were valuable, and Henry was not going to release them cheaply. Some prisoners spent years in England, living in relatively comfortable captivity, while their families scraped together the enormous ransoms demanded. Others died in captivity, never seeing France again. The capture of so many French nobles at Agincourt enriched the English crown and many English nobles who held prisoners. The most famous prisoner was Charles, Duke of Orléans, a nephew of the French king and one of the highest-ranking nobles in France. He was captured at Agincourt and spent the next 25 years as a prisoner in England. He would eventually be released, but only after paying a massive ransom. During his captivity, he wrote poetry, becoming one of the most accomplished poets of the medieval period. His experience illustrated the strange nature of noble captivity, comfortable in material terms, but a profound loss of freedom and years of life. Agincourt marked a turning point in medieval warfare. The battle demonstrated conclusively that the dominance of armored cavalry was not absolute. Under the right circumstances, with favorable terrain and effective missile troops, infantry could defeat cavalry decisively. This was not the first time infantry had defeated cavalry. The Scots had done so at Bannockburn, the Flemish had done so at Courtrai, but Agincourt was different in scale and in the completeness of the victory. The French had committed their finest troops and had been annihilated. The lesson was undeniable. Future battles would see less reliance on cavalry charges and more emphasis on combined arms tactics. Infantry armed with pikes and other pole weapons would be used to counter cavalry, missile troops, whether archers or later gunpowder weapons, would be integrated more carefully into battle plans. The age of the knight was not over, but it was declining. The social implications were significant. The medieval social order was built on the military superiority of the mounted knight. A man who could afford armor and a warhorse could dominate the battlefield, and therefore could claim social and political power. If common archers could defeat knights, what did that mean for the social hierarchy? The answer would unfold over the following centuries. The power of the feudal nobility would gradually decline. Centralized monarchies would rely more on paid professional armies and less on feudal levies. The military basis of noble power would erode, and with it, the political dominance of the aristocracy. Agincourt did not cause these changes by itself, but it was a vivid demonstration of a process that was already underway. The battle showed that the old ways of war were becoming obsolete. Those who adapted would survive. Those who did not would face destruction. Agincourt was the high point of the English longbow as a weapon of war. The battle demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness in ideal circumstances. The longbow would continue to be used in English armies for another century, but it would gradually be supplanted by firearms. The longbow required years of training to use effectively. An archer had to develop the strength and technique to draw a war bow, and this took practice from childhood. English law mandated archery practice, but as the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, these mandates were increasingly ignored. Firearms, by contrast, required relatively little training. A man could learn to use a musket in weeks. The weapon was less accurate and had a slower rate of fire than the longbow, but it could be deployed in far greater numbers because it did not require a lifetime of training. By the late 16th century, the longbow had largely disappeared from English armies, replaced by firearms. Agincourt became a memory, a legend of a weapon and a style of warfare that no longer existed. But the memory remained powerful. The longbow became a symbol of English military prowess, and Agincourt became the example cited to prove that English soldiers could defeat any odds. For Henry V, personally, Agincourt was the defining achievement of his reign. He had won one of the most spectacular military victories in English history. He had validated his claim to the French throne. He had secured his position as King of England. His reputation was made. He would continue to campaign in France, winning more victories and gradually conquering Normandy. In 1420, he forced the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized him as heir to the French throne. It seemed that he might actually achieve his goal of uniting England and France under one crown. But Henry died in 1422, at the age of 35, probably from dysentery contracted during another campaign in France. He never lived to become King of France. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited both the English and French crowns, but the union did not last. The French rallied under Joan of Arc and gradually pushed the English out of France. By 1453, England had lost nearly all its French possessions. The 100 Years' War ended with French victory. Agincourt, for all its drama and glory, had not changed the strategic reality. England was too small and too distant to hold France permanently. The war had been a centuries-long struggle that ended with both kingdoms exhausted and England's continental ambitions permanently curtailed. But Agincourt lived on in memory. It became part of English national mythology, a moment when the underdog triumphed against impossible odds. The battle was celebrated in ballads and chronicles. Centuries later, Shakespeare would immortalize it in Henry V, creating the version of the battle that most people know today. The historical reality of Agincourt and the mythological version diverged over time. The numbers were exaggerated. English sources claimed the French army numbered 100,000 or more. making the English victory seem even more miraculous. The ratio was probably closer to 4 or 5 to 1, still impressive but not the 40 to 1 of legend. The moral lessons drawn from the battle were shaped to fit contemporary needs. Agincourt became a story about courage, about defying the odds, about the triumph of the righteous. The brutal realities, the execution of prisoners, the role of disease and starvation in weakening the English army, the luck of terrain and weather, these were downplayed or forgotten. What remained was the core narrative. A small, outnumbered English army, led by a brave king, defeated a vast French force through superior tactics, discipline, and divine favor. This narrative was useful. It inspired English soldiers in later wars. It reinforced English national identity. It provided a template for understanding underdog victories in any context. And that mythological version has proven remarkably durable. Agincourt remains famous centuries after the battle, remembered by people who know little else about the 100 Years' War. The image of English archers cutting down French knights has become iconic. The battle has transcended its historical context and become a symbol. The field where Agincourt was fought is still there, now covered with crops and small villages. There is a museum and a memorial. Visitors can walk the ground and try to imagine what happened on that muddy October day 6 centuries ago. But the battlefield has changed. Modern agriculture has leveled the field. The woods that confined the fighting have been cut back or removed. The mud that decided the battle dries in summer and freezes in winter. Standing on the field, it is difficult to picture the horror that occurred there. The quiet farmland gives no hint of the thousands who died, whose blood soaked this earth, whose bodies were piled in heaps and left to rot. History has sanitized the site. We remember the battle as a triumph of tactics and courage. We forget that it was also a place where men drowned in mud, suffocated under piles of corpses, and were cut down while trying to surrender. This is the nature of historical memory. We preserve what is useful or inspiring and forget what is uncomfortable. Agincourt has been remembered as a glorious victory, and in military terms, it was. But it was also a massacre, a failure of leadership, a demonstration of how overconfidence and poor planning can turn numerical superiority into catastrophic defeat. What can we learn from Agincourt 600 years later? The specific tactics are obsolete. We do not fight with longbows and plate armor anymore. The geopolitical context has changed completely. England and France are allies, not enemies. The 100 Years' War is ancient history, but some lessons transcend their historical moment. Agincourt teaches us that numbers do not guarantee victory. The larger force has an advantage, but that advantage can be negated by terrain, tactics, and leadership. The French outnumbered the English dramatically, but they could not bring their numbers to bear. Effectively, the narrow field, the mud, and their own poor coordination turned their strength into a weakness. Agincourt teaches us that overconfidence is dangerous. The French believed they had already won. They did not take the English seriously as a threat. They did not carefully consider the terrain or the conditions. They assumed their armor and their numbers would be sufficient. This assumption killed them. Agincourt teaches us that desperation can be a force multiplier. The English had no retreat, no escape. They had to fight or die. This focused their efforts in a way that the French, who believed they could afford to lose men, could not match. Men who know they are doomed fight differently than men who expect to survive, and Agincourt teaches us about the power of narrative. The battle itself was a tactical victory with limited strategic impact. England did not conquer France. The 100 Years' War continued for decades more. But the story of Agincourt, the narrative of the underdog triumph, has outlived the strategic realities. It has become a myth that carries its own truth, independent of historical fact. If there is a single image that captures Agincourt, it is not of victory or glory. It is of exhausted men standing in mud, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, barely able to believe they are still alive. Men who marched for weeks in starvation, who fought against overwhelming odds, who survived through a combination of skill, luck, and the catastrophic errors of their opponents. These men were not heroes in the modern sense. They were soldiers doing what soldiers do, following orders, trying to survive, killing when necessary. Some of them would later commit atrocities, executing prisoners on royal command. Some would return home and live ordinary lives. Some would die in later battles. They were human, flawed, and mortal. But for one afternoon in October 1415, they achieved something extraordinary. They defeated an army that should have destroyed them. They survived when survival seemed impossible, and in doing so, they created a moment that history would remember, long after they and their world had turned to dust. The battle where 2,000 men defeated 80,000 soldiers. The impossible victory. The triumph of desperation over confidence, of tactics over numbers, of fortune over expectation. Agincourt remains, 6 centuries later, a reminder that in war, as in life, nothing is certain until the last arrow has fallen and the final sword has been sheathed. The field at Agincourt is quiet now. The dead are long buried. The mud has dried and been planted over countless times. But the story endures. And it endures because it speaks to something fundamental in human experience. The possibility, however remote, that the underdog can prevail, that skill and courage can overcome raw power, that history is not predetermined. That is the legacy of Agincourt. Not the tactics or the weapons or the politics, but the idea that the impossible can become possible, that the doomed can be saved, that 2,000 men, starving and exhausted in the mud of a French field, can face 80,000 and live to see another dawn. The battle is over. The war is long finished. The soldiers are dust. But the moment remains, frozen in time, a testament to human courage and human folly, to the cruel randomness of war and the enduring power of the stories we tell about it. Agincourt, October 25th, 1415. The day the world witnessed what should never have happened. The day the impossible became history.